Welcome back to this conference. My name is Ong Keng Yong. In case those of you cannot recognize me, as you can see, I got younger by not being in Singapore. This morning we have very useful first session, and now we are ready for the second panel. And all of you are familiar with the two speakers we have. First is Minister Lawrence Wong, and then we have Mr. Donald Low. He is also Senior Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School as well as the Institute of Policy Studies. I don't think I need to go through the background of Minister Lawrence Wong. You have heard just now that all the PAP leaders are almost elitists. And his latest bio in the booklet confirmed that he is almost elitist. Yeah? Almost. And he has to convince all of you afterward that he is not, as what many of you say, PAP is elitist. But he has a very rich education, and what I particularly like to say is that I got to know him when he was working in the civil service, and I find it interesting to listen to his views, so you can hear Minister Lawrence Wong in a while. And for Donald Low, he is almost elitist also, because he went to all these places in the UK and America, and one of those guys that Chang Heng Chi said have come out with tertiary education. But the trouble with Donald is that he does not want to be known as elitist, and so he has gone the other way. He has left the civil service and refused to be in politics. But he is a useful commentator, and you can hear his piece afterward, after Minister Wong has delivered this morning's first presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Minister Lawrence Wong, Minister for Ministry of CCY, to deliver his speech. Minister, please.
Thanks very much, Keng Yong, for the warm introduction. I'm glad he used the word almost, because that means there's hope for me and Donald yet. Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, over the past few months, I've been attending many dialogues and participated in many conversations. And in these sessions, I've heard a range of feedback and views on quite a number of policy issues, whether it's education, healthcare, transport, housing, a whole lot of issues that people have raised up. But beyond the policy issues, there is a search for something deeper. What Singapore stands for, what it means to be a Singaporean. One participant at the dialogue felt that Singapore had changed too quickly over the past few years. And he felt that he no longer had the same sense of connection with our country. Or as another participant put it more vividly, he said, and I quote, "I would like to see a Singapore where buildings are not just commercial premises like shopping centers. I want Singapore to build and promote its traditions from 20 years ago, such as coffee shops, bracket, no aircon please, mama shops, Malay barber shops, the old dragon design playgrounds." So nearly 50 years after gaining independence, Singapore and Singaporeans are examining big questions today. Who are we? What are our values? These are critical questions as we try to make sense of the changes occurring around us. There's no doubt life was tougher in the past. but fighting colonial, communist, and communal forces and overcoming deprivation gave older Singaporeans a powerful sense of shared memories and common destiny. There was a strong sense of group solidarity, loyalty to extended families, and social cohesion. Today, our environment is becoming more interconnected, more complex, and more uncertain. Advances in technology, the growth of global migration and trade have intensified the pace, the intensity, and the volume of interaction between our people. And all these means that the experience of being Singaporean is becoming more varied. Different Singaporeans will have different priorities, some needing to focus on meeting basic needs, others on wider aspirations, and many on a mix of both. Ultimately, these issues of identity and social anchors relate back to how we want to govern ourselves. The roles of the government will have to evolve. Among our principles of governance are some enduring ones that continue to be important, because after all, we have to deal with the same strategic realities. Our geography, our history, and our multi-religious and multiracial population have not changed. However, as new challenges arise, fresh principles will emerge, or we will need fresh interpretations of enduring principles. And in this changing environment, all Singaporeans, from the government and businesses to civil society and individual citizens, must come together to forge a new compact that will allow Singapore to navigate the way forward. Governing in the future will mean casting new roles and relations between the government and citizens and among citizens themselves, while strengthening and reinforcing values that Singaporeans cherish. So the question is, how should our governance principles evolve to address the challenges of the future? Let me share my views in 4 areas. First, the issue of meritocracy as a governing principle. This has been the topic of debate recently. And I think if you ask most Singaporeans, they would agree that meritocracy has served us well. As a small country, Singapore cannot compete in the world if we do not harness the talents of our people. Moreover, in a multi-ethnic society, any form of discrimination would easily have created resentment and tensions. So ability and performance are a fair and objective basis for making decisions, whether it is appointments in the public or private sectors, or admission to our institutions of higher learning. Having said that, there are concerns that with growing income inequalities, a system of meritocracy would favor those with means, and this can undermine social mobility and lead to stratification in society. And I understand the concerns. We all have hardwired in us a deep moral belief and instinct for fairness and due desert. We agree that people deserve rewards for ability and hard work. So when someone is held back by multiple layers of disadvantage through no fault of his or her own, it upsets our sense of fairness. Clearly, unfettered meritocracy taken to an extreme can lead to inequality and a winner-takes-all society. But that does not mean that meritocracy is inherently bad or dysfunctional. More importantly, if we are not going on merit, then how else are we going to determine a person's progression through school or work? And this thought came to me when I was having a session with several polytechnic students some time back. They raised various concerns, but one of the concerns they had was about PSLE stress. Again, an issue of recent debate, very topical nowadays. So I asked them if they would prefer a system where we did not have PSLE, but progression was based on some form of balloting, which happens in other countries. Interestingly, no one wanted such a system. They all still favored some form of academic assessment, preferably less stressful than the current PSLE, with progression still based on merit. So we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The challenge for us is to improve our system of meritocracy. We do not want a meritocracy that breeds excessive competition, where people seek primarily to advance their individual interests at the expense of others. We do not want a meritocracy that results in a closed group of winners, where advantages to any individual are ascribed by birth. What we want is to shape a system of meritocracy in Singapore that works for the benefit of all and is consistent with our ideals for a fair and just society. It's not going to be easy to do this, and there are no ready-made solutions. As Amartya Sen once said, the idea of meritocracy may have many virtues, but clarity is not one of them. Policy-wise, there are things we can and are doing to keep our system open and mobile. And that's why we have already initiated several significant changes in education, for example, by increasing state investments in preschool so that children can get an equal start in life. And we will continue to study and review how our policies need to be updated to give full opportunity to every child, especially those who come from disadvantaged homes, to fulfill their potential. At the same time, those who have succeeded must think beyond themselves and give back to society. They have to show that they care for their fellow citizens, for example, through philanthropy. We see this in the US. People who have become rich are setting up foundations and doing good work. Mayor Bloomberg was just in the news recently for donating more than $1 billion to his alma mater, Johns Hopkins University. Here too, Singaporeans are donating generously to good causes. More people should do so, according to their means and from their heart. Just as we embrace the value of meritocracy, we should also set new social norms for more giving and philanthropy in Singapore. It is also important to have a broader and more appropriate conception of meritocracy, one that goes beyond academic success or achievements in a few selected careers. And we are in a better position to do this today than years back, because our economy has become more sophisticated, thereby creating many more venues for talents in different areas to be recognized. We already see more and more young Singaporeans pursuing their interests in a diverse range of areas, whether it's arts, fashion, music, sports, and we should continue to celebrate talents in these different fields and recognize those who excel, those who overcome adversity, those who show spirit, character, and determination. Besides meritocracy, public policy in Singapore has also been guided by a deep appreciation of the critical interdependence between markets and government. This is a long-standing issue. In fact, the tension between markets and government is not new, nor is it unique to Singapore. It has been the central issue in the evolution of political economy and governance models over the last 200 years. And the reality is that neither markets nor government can work effectively on their own. Market principles are needed to help governments work better, and good government is necessary to help markets function more effectively. The balance between markets and government is never static and has to be recalibrated continually according to circumstance and context. The recent global financial crisis and the stresses associated with globalization have put spotlight on the imperfections and the limitations of relying only on the market. I believe all of us know that from our own personal experience, and I have a story to tell from my previous job at the Energy Market Authority, EMA. We know that we have a high reliance on imported pipe gas from our neighbors, largely our neighbor from the south. And because of our high reliance, the government had decided to import liquefied natural gas to diversify our gas supply sources and enhance our energy security. A private company was appointed to build our first LNG terminal. You need the terminal infrastructure in order to bring in liquefied natural gas. But when the financial crisis struck in 2007, project financing tightened up, and the project became commercially non-viable. We had a choice. We could have waited and said, let the crisis pass, accept some delays in the project. But we decided that this was important enough to our energy security that it could not be left to the vagaries of the market. So EMA took over the terminal project. We quickly set up a company, assembled a project team virtually from scratch. We got a loan from the Ministry of Finance and got the project started again. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to see it through. This was in 2011 when I entered politics. But since then, I've continued to keep track of the terminal progress, and I'm glad that in a few months' time, under EMA hands, the LNG terminal will be completed, and we will soon be able to import LNG and begin our process of fuel diversification for energy security. So this is a story with a happy ending of how the government successfully stepped in to address a market failure. And indeed, this is something that the government has been doing since 1959, repeatedly in various sectors, from housing to banking, from the airline industry to military armament, a whole range of areas where government has been active. But we also know that there are problems with relying too much on the government. So take again the same example of the power sector, but go back further in time. Many years ago, our power plants and grid used to be owned and operated centrally by the Public Utilities Board. It was all run by the government. Some people think that that is better. Well, in government hands, PUB at that time thought that they were doing all they could to be efficient and that they were ready for the functions to be spun off and privatized. Then in private hands, the company, which was eventually formed, Singapore Power, realized that there were still areas for efficiency improvements and for costs to be trimmed. The privatization and subsequent liberalization of the electricity market in Singapore brought more concrete benefits to consumers, because under the heat of market competition, power companies aggressively switched away from the more expensive oil-fired plants to the more cost-efficient natural gas power plants. And if the power plants had all remained in government hands, this switch to gas would have taken a much longer time to materialize, and consumers would have been worse off. So this is the challenge in public policy. The debate is not about nationalization versus market competition as though they were mutually exclusive options. It's not about government intervening to supplant markets or allowing market forces to reign unbridled with little or no government oversight. Rather, the real issue is about finding the right balance between markets and government, recognizing that both are necessary. The fact is that in our next phase of development, with slower growth and with an aging population, the state will have to do more, and the state will have to play a more significant role in funding or providing certain core services. I mentioned preschool education earlier, where the government will make significant investments. We are also doing a lot more to strengthen our social safety net. In transport, we are making massive investments to expand the rail network and provide more buses. And another area is healthcare, where government spending will double to $8 billion over the next 5 years. So government spending will go up, and as it goes up, we must also ensure that there are sufficient resources to fund and sustain the programs we want. We can see the mistakes other countries have made, how easy it is for governments to spend beyond their means and end up with large fiscal burdens and structural deficits. More importantly, state provisions have to be designed so as not to reduce the dignity of individuals, erode work ethic, or create dependency on the state. Otherwise, after some time, the economy will stagnate and the people suffer. So what we are striving for in Singapore is not bigger government, but smarter and better government. One that understands the interdependencies between the state and markets, one that is responsive to the needs of our time while maintaining the competitive spirit and drive that is so crucial to our existence. The government will do its part to facilitate and lead in terms of broad policy directions, but it has no monopoly of knowledge or ideas. To understand and tackle our challenges fully and vigorously, we need to draw on the expertise and resources of all our people. So this leads me to my next point, my third point, on the importance of active citizenry, strong communities, and vibrant civil society. Over the years, we have raised the level of engagement between the government and the people. opened up more space for civic groups and alternative views, and matured as a society. The growing participation and diversity have been vital pluses for Singapore, enabling us to adapt to changing conditions and to the needs and expectations of a new generation. Going forward in our new environment, I have no doubt that our society will continue to open up further. Younger Singaporeans in particular would like to have more space to express themselves, voice diverse views, and experiment with new ways of doing things. And these are positive trends. They show that Singaporeans care about issues and want to play a part in shaping the future of our country. Governance must keep pace with these changes in our society. It means more engagement and consultation in policy formulation. It also means more effort on the part of everyone involved to listen to one another, to actively seek out viewpoints that challenge our own assumptions and beliefs, so that we can begin to understand where the people who disagree with us are coming from. Ultimately, we want to discuss issues with reason, passion, and conviction, but also in a spirit of respect, so that people with legitimate but bridgeable differences can sit down at the same table and hash things out. And that is why we embarked on the Singapore Conversation. It is a process for the whole nation to have a conversation about what values are important to us, to engender a sense of rootedness, and to build a stronger consensus on the way forward for Singapore. Such engagement is not new to us. In fact, the government has been engaging Singaporeans in various forms and platforms over the years. But the scale and scope of engagement this time is much wider. Besides more consultation and engagement on policy issues, we also want to promote active participation in solving problems. The late Mr. Rajaratnam described this as strengthening a democracy of deeds and not just words. As he put it, we must, and I quote, encourage participation at all levels to get people away from adversarial democracy to a problem-solving democracy. And to facilitate this, the government should pull back from being all things to all citizens and give Singaporeans the opportunity and space to organize themselves and develop their own solutions. Many people have observed that when there is a problem in Singapore, the first thing Singaporeans usually ask is, what will the government do about this? So at a recent conversation, I was struck when a poly student said, why must there always be a policy solution to our problems? This is from a young student. Why can't we solve the problems by ourselves? And I learned a new word at the session too, because she said, maybe we should do more unpolicy. And it's refreshing to hear that. And it's not unique to this particular session, because just over this weekend, I had another session with university students, and the theme of that session was more than ourselves, a generation that cares. So these young people reflect the coming of age of a new generation who are more active and engaged and prepared to do their part for the community. We should encourage more of such civic activism to empower and support Singaporeans to take the initiative and make a difference to the lives of others. This is how we can nurture the kampung spirit in our urban city and strengthen the sense of togetherness in our society. Finally, let me end on the role of leadership in governance. We have always believed that leadership is key, that as a small country we need good leaders, almost elitist, as Keng Yong would describe, and able people to serve whether in the political arena or in public administration. In a new environment of active citizenry and civic participation, one might be tempted to think that leadership is no longer important. On the contrary, I believe that leadership remains just as, if not more, critical. But the leadership demands are different. In a complex and rapidly changing environment, knowledge is always localized and fleeting. As a result, leaders are sometimes faced with an inversion of expertise, where people below you may have more accurate information and are better able to adapt and respond to changing circumstances. A recent survey by the public relations firm Edelman shows that people tend to put more trust in their peer group, defined as a person like me, than in traditional authority figures. So trust is being expressed in horizontal ways rather than solely on a vertical axis. And the leadership approach must evolve to one that encourages more open collaboration, feedback, and empowerment of our people. You can see this happening everywhere in organizations, including in the military. The former US commander in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal, this is special ops, all the badges, a real soldier. He once described how he had to adapt to a new leadership style, to operate in a complex network environment, and more importantly, to earn the trust and confidence of a younger generation of soldiers. He said he had to become a lot more transparent, a lot more willing to listen, a lot more willing to be reverse mentored from below. Over time, McChrystal said he had come to realize that leaders aren't good because they are right, they are good because they are willing to learn and trust. And it sounds easy to do all this, but in fact, leadership in this new environment will be far more challenging. It means having the humility to admit that we don't always have all the answers. It means having the courage to take risks and trust our people to make the right decisions. With a more diverse population, leaders will have to gather a wider range of suggestions and ideas and take time to build a consensus. It is not always possible to align everyone to the same view. So leaders also have to decide, explain the basis for the decisions they make, and take responsibility for the outcomes. And as short-term populist interests gain increased voice and traction, leaders must have the moral courage and integrity to retain the long-term perspective and make the difficult decisions that will yield long-term benefits to Singapore and its citizens. This ability to look beyond the short term, to look beyond the current electoral cycle, has been crucial to the success of many of our policies. Today, it will be harder to take a long-term view, even as the government's policies and actions are being subjected to daily barracking. The daily incessant round of the 24-hour news cycle, the noise amplified by social media, will make governance more difficult here, as it has elsewhere. And this calls for more, not less leadership. And indeed, it is not just a question of political leadership. It is more fundamentally about what sort of government we want and the kind of society we want to be. Meritocracy, the role of the state and markets, active citizenry, and leadership. I've touched on 4 aspects of governance where I believe our principles have to adapt and change in order to stay relevant in a new environment. In charting the way forward, we no longer have the benefit of following and adapting best practices by others who are ahead of us. In many ways, we have to break new ground ourselves and find fresh solutions that are suited to our circumstance and our context. Increasingly, we will have to experiment, make some mistakes, learn from them, and improve ourselves. More and more is now expected of governments. Some say that it is impossible to meet the high expectations. But almost 50 years ago, the cynics and critics said that a small resource-scarce country with no hinterland had little chance of survival. And in the 60s and 70s, some people thought that in order to survive, a country had to be protectionist and favor domestic production. Singapore proved that we could be exceptional each time. We not only survived, but thrived. We eschewed import substitution and found advantages from free trade. So the big questions of today are the challenges of our generation. We can defy critics and cynics again if we answer these questions together. Thank you very much.
Over to you, Donald.
Good morning, Minister, distinguished guests. Janada's first thing I must say is you made a terrible choice in asking me to be a commentator, because the remarks I prepared broadly echo Minister's comments. We hadn't coordinated, but the themes and the issues I'm going to discuss very much similar to what Minister has mentioned. probably reflects the fact that we've been reading the same books, or maybe you've been reading too many of my articles, or maybe it simply reflects our common civil service background and worked under the same bosses, the same mentors. But maybe I'll just try to frame issues a bit differently. Earlier, Prof. Mahbubani and Prof. Channing Chi emphasized the fact that the PAP government is actually a very adaptive, highly flexible, it's a learning government, right? And so maybe what I'll do in my remarks and response to Minister is to highlight the risks of atrophy in government, because I don't think those risks of atrophy, of inadequate pressure for it to adapt, I don't think those risks are trivial. I think they are very real, given how long it's been in power, given how successful it has been on the current model. And maybe I'll start with a quote that, from a very thoughtful critic of the Singapore system. He's Singaporean. I sent him some my remarks as well as some of my previous articles and this is what he said. Hi Donald, I read the pieces on inequality and meritocracy that you sent the links on. You provide a most useful challenge to uncontested and tired mantras. My question is this: to what extent are civil servants, and especially AOs like you, educated about or familiar with such theories in the Western social science literature? Do they read this stuff as you do? If not, why are they different? Or why are you different and why don't they? And if they do read the same stuff as you do, why do they come to different conclusions or none at all? Related to that is the frustration that many of these alternate views that are expressed in Singapore by opposition parties and in the Singapore conversation are naive, simplistic, and impractical, so easy to dismiss. Why then is there not a vibrant, multifaceted discourse that can yield potential, if experimental, new solutions? Is it because we are too small, have too limited and undiverse an intelligentsia, which is anyway mostly captured in the civil service, his words, not mine? Or is it the inevitable result of generations of suppression of freedom of speech that has not let up? I think very sombering words for us to think about. And the main issue that I want to address in my comments as Minister has is how we can sustain good, adaptive, forward-looking governance in an era of rapid and disruptive change. I think, and I agree with Minister on this, Singapore will face greater volatility, uncertainty, and complexity in our operating environment. We've seen this politically. The government space has maneuvered, the government space for maneuver has narrowed considerably. Its traditionally admired solutions in a number of areas, housing, healthcare, education, transport, and infrastructure, have come under greater scrutiny, debate, and even discontent in recent years. We've also experienced this economically. In the last 15 years, we've experienced more economic shocks and slowdowns than in the 30 years before that. And these economic and political trends will interact with our social forces, rapid aging of our population, rising inequality, wage stagnation, lower social mobility, rising foreigner presence, to create new stresses on society and social cohesion. I think the main thrust of all this is that citizens' trust in government's ability to deliver can no longer be assumed. The pristine policy lab, right, the term policy lab was used by the Prime Minister several years ago. The pristine policy lab that our policymakers used to operate in is being replaced by a more critical public and a more diverse polity with competing interests. Increasingly, our policymakers no longer have to remind themselves of hard truths, but also have to make hard choices where they're winners and losers. Now, sustaining good governance in this new context is not impossible, but it will require significant institutional and policy reforms on the part of government, and Minister touched on those, and on some of those. My own view is that in the era of rapid and disruptive change, the most valuable asset that government can have is resilience. What's resilience? Resilience, in my definition, is the capacity of a system to bounce back, not necessarily to its original form, but to a state that allows it to maintain its core purpose and integrity and continue performing its essential functions. You can apply resilience thinking to a number of areas. You can apply to an ecological system, to an organization, to the internet, or to individual species. And resilience is usually a function of two things. First, a resilience system is one that has been exposed to a variety of shocks. Each of these shocks is not large enough to destroy the system, but over time they force the system to adapt and to develop diverse capabilities to respond to a wider range of shocks and stimuli. This is Ashby's law of requisite variety. I think one of the questioners earlier highlighted this. And conversely, systems which are fragile are those which have been insulated from shocks or protected from competition. This is why the Galapagos Islands are ecologically so fragile. And we also saw in the financial crisis how a lack of biodiversity in the financial system created a highly fragile economic system. Now, the second essential ingredient of a resilient system is selection. Resilient systems all have some mechanism for choosing between competing strategies, competing designs. And we normally think, and certainly in the Singapore context, that's how we think, we normally think of the selection process as being undertaken by individuals at the top or by leaders. But we can also think of the selection process as being the result of impersonal forces such as the market. Markets are resilient because they encourage variety, they encourage diversity, and because they provide strong signals for agents or for firms to select the fit strategies and designs, and then to quickly replicate and scale them up. This is why the economist William Balmer calls markets innovation machines. Now, I've applied this resilience perspective to ecological systems, to the economy. It can also be used to our study of governance systems, which is the subject of today's conference. Now, if you agree that what governance needs most in the context of rapid disruptive change in an environment of uncertainty and complexity, if you agree that what the governments need is resilience, then we will also say that it needs to foster variety, it needs to foster selection, and also selection processes that are not reliant on just a few individuals making the right calls. It's very tempting for the human mind to respond to greater uncertainty and complexity with a desire for more control, for more stability, for more harmony. You see that desire expressed very strongly, for instance, in the Chinese political system. But the reality is that the avoidance of shocks and avoidance of failures, trying to insulate ourselves from external signals, is a utopian dream, right? More problematically, such insulation weakens the signals for the system to adapt and breeds strategic brittleness and flexibility and inflexibility. A political system can also suffer from too much mimicry and have too little biodiversity to allow for the experimentation and the adaptation that is necessary for long-term survival. And without sufficient diversity, a political system can also become trapped by groupthink and ideological rigidity. And I think this resilience perspective, this emphasis on diversity, on variety, and on selection ought to replace the vulnerability narrative that this government often relies on. Rather than emphasize our vulnerability and how this imposes all sorts of constraints and on what Singapore can be or can do, resilience thinking frames our discussion on governance differently and expansively. It invites us to think about what shock absorbers and what institutional shock absorbers we need in a more volatile world, how we can achieve a better allocation of risks between the state and citizens, and how we should secure Singaporeans' confidence for the future. I've identified resilience as the central imperative of our political system today, and I want to just respond also to Minister by highlighting two areas of reforms in our public institutions that would be suggested by the resilience perspective. The first is we need better institutions to safeguard good governance in Singapore. And the second is we need to think about how we want to reform meritocracy. First, better institutions. Now, some of you will be familiar with the principles of governance that are taught in our schools, that are drummed into our civil servants. And there are four of these principles of governance. The first is leadership is key, and Minister talked about this at quite some length. And the elaboration of this principle is that given our inherent vulnerability, see how much the vulnerability thinking frames our discourse here. Because of our vulnerability, Singapore needs leaders of great ability, high integrity, individuals who will do what is right, not what is popular. Those are actually taught, by the way, in our schools. And I think most Singaporeans will agree that effective, far-sighted, visionary leadership is essential for Singapore. But if you apply a resilience lens, as opposed to just a vulnerability perspective, then we're likely to say that, yes, leadership is important, but good institutions matter too, and probably matter more in the long run. Leadership is, as Minister highlighted, is highly context-dependent. Good leaders in one context may make for terrible ones in another. Churchill was a great wartime prime minister, but was far less effective in peacetime. But I think more importantly and more problematically, the leadership is key principle goes against the grain of the argument that I was making earlier, that what determines resilience is not some wise man or group of elites knowing what the right answers are. Rather, it is by ensuring sufficient variety and diversity in the system that we enhance our resilience. And in the long run, I believe that we are better off relying on a system of distributed intelligence, on Singapore having a diversity of ideas and competing options, than on a system that is critically dependent on a similar group of people, no matter how bright they may be. And top academic institutions understand this. Harvard, Wharton, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, we have a particular rule, and it's that we don't hire our own PhD graduates for the first 3 or 5 years after they graduate. And we do this to preserve cognitive diversity in our institution and to reduce the risks of intellectual incest. So beyond the leadership is key principle, I would really like to see a principle of governance around the importance of having good, robust, credible institutions that support diversity, that support dissent, right? We need to institutionalize dissent in the Singapore system. Let's support constant experimentation and selection. And translating, what does it mean in practice? I think translating this into practice would see the government giving citizens and scholars more access to information and supporting social science research as much as it does the hard sciences. This greater transparency would bolster trust in our system of governance and enhance government's credibility. Encouraging greater variety might also mean instituting the practice of red teams versus blue teams across government to encourage a healthy contest of ideas. It's been done quite successfully in the US military. They have this thing called the Red Team University, whose only job is to constantly question, challenge prevailing conventional wisdoms among military commanders. Now, in the recent past, certainly since the elections of 2011, government leaders have frequently expressed their concern that with increasing political diversity and plurality, Singapore might become so polarized that government becomes paralyzed. I'm actually more worried about how the very human desire for more control, for harmony and stability, might weaken the already weak incentives for policymakers to allow competing ideas to surface and to subject these to serious debate and analysis. In short, I'm less worried about the risks or the dangers of polarization than I am about the effects of incumbency, the inertia of the status quo, and the tyranny of old ideas. A second principle of governance that we hold dear is meritocracy. Minister spoke at length about this. And I think the real question is not whether we should or should not have meritocracy. I think most Singaporeans accept that this is a core principle of governance, the basis for a successful, vibrant society. I think the real question we should be asking is what kind of meritocracy do we want to be? And I believe there are actually varieties of, just as there are varieties of capitalism, there are also varieties of meritocracy. And one of the key questions we should be asking ourselves is what kind of rules do we want, right, to constrain the behavior of those who have done well in our meritocratic system. There is no prima facie reason to believe that those who have succeeded will channel their energies to improve society's well-being. And in fact, indeed, as the crisis has shown, it's entirely possible that those who have succeeded in a meritocracy engage in morally hazardous activities and demand government bailouts when the risks they have taken go bad. The kind of meritocracy that was practiced on Wall Street also breeds a certain self-justifying entitlement narrative. For instance, Wall Street bankers justified the decision to pay themselves millions in bonuses from taxpayers' bailout monies on the grounds that if they didn't do so, talent would leave the financial industry. This kind of meritocracy breeds a belief among its beneficiaries, among the winners, that they are entitled to their rewards, that the market system is inherently just, and that inequality is natural. They view those who have not succeeded in the system as slothful, lazy, or lacking in merit, and thus undeserving of government support. As Singaporeans, we are often reminded of the risks and moral hazard problems of providing more help for the poor. This is the main justification why we cannot have a welfare state. I think the crisis is a timely reminder that the risks of moral hazard are actually much greater when the rich are not properly regulated. Corporate malfeasance imposes a much larger cost on society than the so-called entitlement mentality or the factlessness of the poor addicted to government welfare. So to conclude, I would very much like to see the principle of meritocracy augmented by a principle that emphasizes fairness and social justice, and I was very pleased to hear Minister reiterate that point. What does this mean again in practice? I think translating the principles of fairness and social justice into practice would mean assiduously avoiding conflicts of interest in our public institutions, ensuring the independence, both commercial as well as political independence of our institutions, having strong safeguards against regulatory capture, and increasing transparency and public accountability. It also means strengthening our social safety nets and other redistributive institutions, and ensuring a fairer allocation of risks between state and citizens as we enter a more volatile and complex future. Thank you very much.